Greetings, noisemakers. In this video, we're going to break down the way that Steve Richter's didgeridoo live looping video works. And the thing that I want to focus on is that this way that Steve has built his set is a really great example of combining some of the fundamental aspects that we've learned so far into a simple set that works for him. And that's the most important thing. The great thing about Ableton Live is you can build a setup that suits you and fits under your fingers or feet. And so it works well for you and it's quick, and that makes it more musical, really. So in Steve's case, he's used a MIDI controller pedal, and so it's one of these, Keith McMillan Soft Step. They're really cool. You're going to get to see it in the video. And he's also used an APC40, an Akai APC40 controller. And he's used those two MIDI controllers and mapped them to the live interface in a way that works logically for him and is quick and is musical. We're going to have a look at that. He's also incorporated some live sound processing, which we've spoken about as well. In this case, he's used EQ in an effective way to fix an instrument sound that's coming into Ableton. Let's go into the set and have a look. The first thing you might notice is that if you've watched the video through already, Steve has laid the track order out here from left to right, kind of in the order that he's looping things and playing things. In fact, it's not kind of, it definitely is. So the first thing that he loops is the drum, and this drum channel is here. Then he loops some wooden sounds. Then he loops what he's calling highs, which are some high bell sounds. And there's a couple of shaker and clave clips here, and they're really important. We're going to talk about what they're for in a moment. And then he goes on to loop the kanjira, and then he finally finishes with looping or recording, live recording some kalimba, which is the thumb piano. Now you'll notice that in terms of processing and inputs, it's reasonably simple, this set. If we come down to the input-output section, he's basically got input 1 active, and that is the condenser microphone that he's using for everything that he's recording through the condenser microphone. And then he's using input 2, which is obviously an instrument level input for his kalimba, because the kalimba has an instrument pickup inside it. The other thing that you might notice is that he's grouped a whole lot of the tracks together. And in fact, he's grouped the first sort of section of sounds that he loops together. So drum, woods, highs, shaker, and clave. Basically so that if you come down here to the mixer view, he can control whether the audio from those particular tracks is feeding through to the master output using the track activator here. And he's MIDI mapped that. So we're going to talk about that in a second as well. Over here, if we look on the kalimba channels, you'll see that he's put the same EQ on the 3 kalimba channels. 1, 2, 3. And this is because that particular kalimba that he's playing has some frequencies in there that he doesn't want to get passed through. And so the EQ is doing a pretty brutal cut here, around about 3.15 kilohertz. And that's to remove a kind of a harmful for the ears, let's say, frequency, or a nasty frequency that's coming through on that kalimba. So he's used the EQ8 in a really effective way, and so he's able to EQ that sound of that instrument before it passes back out of live and back through the PA. So he has a better instrument sound, basically. It's also important to note how Steve's monitoring setup is working. You can see here in my set that I've got my monitor set to auto at the moment, and that's actually a problem for live performance, because you can see that the inputs of these tracks are being multiplied many numbers of times, because I have my record input armed, and I need that in order to record to these clip slots up here. So when my record arm is engaged down here, it means that I get this nice round clip record button up here, and that means that when I MIDI map the slot, like Steve has here, that slot will record when I send the MIDI message. But what happens is, if I turn this up here, you'll hear a bit of feedback. Somewhere. Here it comes. There it is, a bit of feedback. So my master is turned all the way down at the moment. The solution to that is to have monitor set to off. And that's what Steve would have done for his live set as well, when he actually performed it for the video. And it's important that you have monitor set to off. You'll notice now that the meters are grayed out. And that means that the input to this track, i.e. input 2 or input 1, is not feeding through to the output. And that's important. So basically, all that happens now, if I bring up my master, you can see, if I record one of these clip slots, for example, and I make a bit of a noise, and then I hit go again on the clip slot, it's quantized to the beat. You can see that that's feeding through now. And so it only feeds through when there is a clip on the track playing back. And that's very useful for live performance. Incidentally, if you do want to have a track in Ableton that is giving your live feedback of what's going into the mic, that's also important. Steve didn't need to do that because he was just recording acoustically. But if you do have a PA and you're wanting to feed your direct sound through, you just create a new track. I'll call this direct feed, mic 1, for example. And I'd say, set this to input 1, and then I'd tell it to monitor in. And that will actually give me a direct feed. So you can hear some latency there. But basically that will send direct to front of house. This can also be done directly in your sound card or on your mixer before the audio comes into your sound card, so you send a direct feed directly to the PA or front of house. So the key to this set is actually its simplicity. And so if we look under the bonnet, so to speak, at the MIDI mapping in Ableton, that's where we can see how Steve has built his set to work well with his controllers. So let's go into the MIDI mapping view to have a look at the way Steve has put his set together. Command M opens up the MIDI mapping view. I can also alternatively come up to the right-hand side and click on this MIDI guy. And everything that's blue represents something that can be mapped to a MIDI controller, including my device attributes down here. So a dial on my device can be mapped, as can a lot of the elements of playback and control of loops and clips in Ableton. It can all be mapped to a MIDI controller. So the first thing you might notice is that actually Steve doesn't loop his dig. If you're listening carefully, you can hear that he starts with the didgeridoo, but he doesn't actually loop it. And that's important because he's created the sense for his audience that there's not something coming out of Ableton automatically. He's playing first. So he's playing the dig at the beginning, and that's very musical. The audience is engaged with him and his instrument and not with the laptop. The first thing that he does to get Ableton rolling is he actually fires off these two clips here. One is a clave and one is a shaker. And he fires them off, he triggers them using his APC40. Once they've fired off, he then has a sense of tempo, and they're going to keep him in time. So you'll notice that it's not until he loops the next instrument, which is actually the drum that he picks up. And on the drum channel here, you can see that this top slot here has been MIDI mapped to a note, channel 1, C3. And that is actually a note that's coming in via his foot switch. So that first time that he pushes the foot switch, he's engaging this clip slot here. Next, on the next channel, he starts looping some wooden sounds, some wood blocks. And on this channel, instead of using clip slots, he's going to layer up these wood sounds. So he's using the looper device not as a way to set the transport tempo, which is another method that we learn in other videos in the series, but he's using it just to layer one sound on top of another. And that's this button down here. So he's MIDI mapped C sharp, which is probably the next foot pedal switch on his Keith McMillan footstep. And that's going to basically start looping, and it's set to record X bars. But the good news is that because the transport is already rolling because of his two clips here, basically the looper is going to be quantized to start and end on a beat 1. So all he has to do is press this foot switch mapped button here a little bit before beat 1, and then he knows it's recording from then on, and then he stops it a little bit before beat 1 as well, and it will stop right on a beat 1. He does the same thing with his highs, which are the bells, and then he basically leaves the shaker and clave playing, but he does an important thing, which is quite cool. He does a thing that stops Ableton from playing for a moment. Now the trick here is he doesn't actually stop Ableton playing. He doesn't stop the transport. All that he does is he mutes the group that has all of the audio that was recorded so far. And that's this track activator here. So you can see that where it's channel 1 F3, he's mapped one of his foot pedals to basically deactivate the track and not feed anything through. And you'll notice this section, basically what happens is he stops the music and he does a kanjira drum fill leading into the next section. And then all he has to do is, he's counting his way musically through that break, and then he starts at bang again on 1, and basically the audio, if he grabs it at the right time, will start again beautifully on 1. In fact, he could almost activate it a little bit before 1 and it would still come back in really nicely in time. So next he loops his kanjira, and that's this clip slot up here, and so on and so on. So you can see then come the kalimbas, and he layers a few kalimba layers. Another important point about the kalimbas is that they're sending to some send effects here. All of them are getting a little bit of send A, send B, and send C. So if we look at send A, it's a grain delay with an octave pitch shifter. So that's going to lower the pitch and basically make the instrument sound like it's playing an octave lower as well, and delayed. Nice effect. He's got a filter delay, which is giving him a nice rhythmic delay there. And then he's got a concert hall reverb here. So that's what's giving the kalimba a nice hall sound. So he's using his sends as well to affect the kalimba sound. And he can especially do that in this case because the kalimba has a pickup built in. So it's not a direct microphone. He's basically not going to get any direct feed from a microphone to his PA being affected, so he won't get feedback issues. Basically because as a pickup, it's a lot easier to not get feedback. Last but not least, Steve has used the automatic mapping features of his APC40 to activate tracks and then send the signal from those tracks to the returns to create delays and reverb effects on his dry sounds to basically create a nice washy kind of ending to his piece and then fade it out. It's a nice way to subtly affect and change the sound before he finishes it. So that's been Steve Richter's Didgeridoo live set video breakdown in a nutshell. And so the key points here are that Steve is keeping it very simple and he's keeping it practical and musical for what he needs. He's using controllers that fit easily under his feet and his hands, and he's set the setup in such a way that he doesn't really have to think too much about what he's doing, so he can focus on playing his instruments. And that's the key here. The last thing you want to be thinking about is the technology. You want to be thinking about the music and your dialogue with the audience and how the vibe is going at the gig. You don't want to be thinking about your laptop and Ableton. And Steve's done that really well. Happy noise making.